right, so we are at our third and our final session for today. This one is entitled The Sacred Cycle, an Introduction to the Liturgical Year with the Most Reverend Dr. William Behun, Primate of the United States. And His Grace, Dr. William Behun, is the Archbishop of Wisconsin, even though he lives in Chicago, and is Primate for the United States of America, though he does live in America. He received his PhD in philosophy from DePaul University and is the author of The Historical Pivot, the philosophy of every year.
Every year. Just stop. Don't read the subtitle. That's the solution.
The Historical Pivot, the philosophy of history in Hegel, Schelling, and Hölderlin, as well as articles on a wide range of philosophical topics. In addition to his duties with the AJC, His Grace also teaches philosophy in the Chicago area, specializing in ethics. Why? Because they wanted an outsider's perspective, and the history of philosophy. I thought I'd get that in there before you could do that.
Thank you so much. It has to be said.
And with that, I'm going to put the spotlight on you.
Well, thank you so much. And thank you to all of you. I'm going to adjust my camera real. I'm so rubbish with these cameras. There we go. I think that's probably a little better. It's weird because if I'm looking at the camera, I can't see myself. So it very much confuses me. Thank you, Your Eminence, and thank you to everyone who's made it to yet another conclave. And as I was saying earlier, it's wonderful to see familiar faces, some familiar faces I haven't seen in a while. One particular familiar face that I haven't seen in a while, despite the fact that she's like half a mile from my house. But also to see all of these new faces. So thank you all for joining us. Previous to this conclave, I had done a series on the sacraments, and the purpose of that series was largely to help out seminarians who were working on their papers on the sacraments. And once that cycle ended, His Eminence and I, sort of discussed, what I wanted to do next, because I wanted to continue that process. So one of the things that I'm going to make reference to in this presentation is the fact that this is oriented to a certain extent towards our seminarians, but hopefully it'll be useful for clergy and our laity as well. So I did write out my presentation. I'm not winging it as I have in previous years. Last year I did this and it was an absolute disaster because I wrote 75 pages and completely ran out of time. This will be considerably briefer, so we should have plenty of time for Q&A if people are interested. Being raised Roman Catholic, I was always aware of the liturgical seasons. There was Lent, of course, Advent, and then there was this thing called ordinary time. And it always seemed like a strange designation. And I'd simply assumed that it was ordinary because the other seasons were extraordinary. And in a semantic sense, that's right. But it wasn't until much later that I realized that ordinary time is just ordinary because it's counted in order. And I realized that no part of the liturgical calendar is ordinary in our normal sense of the word. Each day of the year is something extraordinary, something special. Each moment of the church's calendar is magical. Each moment is sacred. Some years ago, I gave a talk at another conclave on the subject of ritual time. And there are a lot of different ways to think about ritual time: magical hours, feast days, astrological aspects, even something as simple as the midnight witching hour. I didn't spend as much time as I probably should have talking about the liturgical calendar as an overarching model for thinking about ritual timing. So my hope is to, in part, rectify that omission in my earlier presentation, but also, as I said, to provide a resource for members of the AJC, especially our seminarians and laity, on the subject of the liturgical calendar and its history and structure. To this end, I hope that this presentation will form another part of this ongoing series that I've tried to offer that matches up with certain topics in our formation program. The overall structure of this presentation will be as follows. I want to introduce some general topics regarding the yearly cycle and begin to make some propedeutic claims regarding the importance of the year as a unit of sacred time. From there, I want to talk more specifically about the structure of the liturgical year as opposed to other ways of thinking about the annual cycle, and finally to look at three separate models of the liturgical year: the Western or Catholic model, the Eastern or Orthodox model, and finally the peculiar liturgical calendar of the Apostolic Johannite Church. This last one is less clearly defined than the other two. And so I hope that I don't misspeak in identifying some of the broad structures that are more implicit than explicit in the AJC liturgical calendar. If I do, I'm sure there will be corrections to follow, but I will, in keeping with my magisterium, be introducing some clarifications in terms of the AJC's seasonal structure. And my hope is that this presentation, though often technical, will not get bogged down in too many details to render it soporific. Time is something inherently sacred. The particular form of Zoroastrianism that I spoke about at last year's conclave that exerted such a profound influence on Manichaeism, the so-called Johannite heresy, identifies the unknown God, the ineffable and primordial source of all that is, the ground of all being, with Zorvan, that is to say, time. For the Greeks, the conflation of Chronos, king of the gods during the Golden Age, and Chronos, or time, was common even in the archaic period. Time rules all things, slays heroes and monsters, and ultimately brings about the fulfillment of all prophecies. We mark being from the beginning of time to the end of time. And time is, as Plato reminds us, the moving picture of eternity. It is time that provides the horizon against which we experience our own existence. And we distinguish ourselves from the divine in terms of time and recognize our own divinity in our temporality. There seems to be something uniquely human about having a relationship with time. We are, perhaps to sort of mutilate Heidegger, that being for whom time is a question, a theme of our consciousness, and the boundary of what can be thought. Personally, I've always been fascinated by the structure of time. As a child, I would make sundials every summer out of a paper plate and a stick. And I struggled to understand why time moved as it did, why it didn't stay accurate. As a philosopher, time and history became the central focus of my professional work. As a priest, time became my doorway to the sacred. The Chaldean oracles announce that the God of the universe is eternal, limitless, both young and old, having a spiral force. This is one of, I think, the most profound sort of descriptions of or characterizations of the divine. The spiral or circle or cycle is ever the symbol of the eternal. What has happened before will happen again. There is nothing new under the sun. Whether we're looking at the hands of a clock, the rising and setting of the sun, the waxing and waning of the moon, the return of the planets, the precession of the equinoxes, or the cycle of the 4 billion plus year kalpa, the movement of time is always something that is cyclical and never merely linear. The great pagan magi of all cultures recognized this and made use of it in their quest for the divine and the eternal. The cycles of the day, the month, the year also had profound practical implications. They ruled the harvest and the tides, the flooding of the Nile. And these rhythms were responsible for the preservation of human life. We depended on these natural cycles for our very existence. The cycles of time provided the framework for what made us human. And it seems perfectly reasonable, therefore, that these cycles should be encoded into sacred symbols, places of worship, and ritual praxis. To understand the cyclical nature of time, the stars, and the universe is to exert power over all that is. There is something magical, in the strict sense of the word, the science of the Magi, about the ability to measure time. One can look at the sky as an enormous clock by which one can measure broad expanses of time. Astrology as a science is rooted in this conception of the universe. I think the naive sense of astrology is that the movement of celestial bodies somehow determines the course of natural and human events. But I think it may be more accurate to suggest that the movement of celestial bodies and events on Earth have a common source in time. I've used this example in the past. If I tell you that I'm giving a lecture in room 117 at 3 p.m. on the 14th, the clock and the calendar don't dictate in any causal way where I'm going to be or how I'm going to move. However, if on the 14th at 20 minutes after 3, you look at your watch, and the position of the hands or the numbers displayed allow you to make an intelligent and informed supposition that I'm in room 117 giving a lecture. Now, you could be wrong. I might have canceled, I might have rescheduled the lecture, it could have been relocated to a different place. And yet, the particular position of the hands on the clock allow you to say something plausible and likely about me. And so, if astrologically we suggest that someone born at a particular date and time in a particular place is likely to have certain qualities or to experience things in a certain way, it isn't that the stars are causing those characteristics, that the stars that denote that particular date and time rather indicate that because of the interconnectedness of the universe, we can boldly assume certain truths. While we think of the year most often in terms of the movement of the seasons or of one particular celestial body, namely the sun, it is against the backdrop of the fixed stars that annual solar movement seems to be most precisely measured. Astrological considerations for ritual timing and the scheduling of holidays and ceremonies are an inherent part of the history of ritual and liturgical practice. Whether we're looking at the rising of Sirius or the return of the sun to the sign of Aries or the particular orientation of the seven sisters or the occurrence of the first full moon after the vernal equinox, astrological considerations have been taken into account in designating certain times and periods to be set apart for the particular worship of God. As I said before, this was well known to our pagan predecessors. Time was always a circle. And the circle was always a symbol of fate. Fate understood not as a predetermination of particular actions by cause-effect relationships, but rather the ultimate working out of the universe according to its own principles, which could not be understood from the perspective of we mere mortals, but could be glimpsed by oracles, priestesses, and shamans. They understood the patterns of the universe because they had a broader perspective than the profanes. The initiate was able to recognize these broader patterns because they were part of something much greater, much longer lasting, something ultimately eternal. The modern pagan revival of the 19th and 20th century did not neglect to take this up in its practice. The so-called Wheel of the Year, while modern in its origin, has its roots in this ancient experience of the rhythm of the world. The modern pagan community rightly prides itself on its harmonious relationship with the cycles of time and nature. Now, this is not entirely unrelated to the commemoration of, for example, the Ember Days at the 4 points of the year in the Christian tradition, as I'm going to note momentarily. In Judaism, the setting apart of the Sabbath as the Lord's Day, as commanded in the Decalogue, forms the basis of the most fundamental substructure of Jewish sacred time. The Hebrew liturgical year is structured in terms of important religious feasts that have specific dates assigned to them according to the lunisolar Babylonian Hebrew calendar, which varies from year to year in relation to the solar Julian or Gregorian calendars. For the most part, these are commemorations of significant events in the history of the Jewish people. This connects the local community both to the natural rhythms of the year and to the history of the broader Hebrew community, which stretches over both space and time. None of any of this is less true for the Christian tradition, though I don't think it would be unfair to say that what was once a lived experience of the intimate relationship between God and the world has become, at its worst, a regimented cycle of empty observances. That is to say, a superstition. But this is not to suggest that this is always, or that it need be the case. And I hope to return to this point at the end of my presentation in regards to the AJC liturgical calendar. Before we turn to the liturgical calendar generally, I would like to say a few brief words about the practice of the Ember Days in the Western Christian tradition. Those of us of, shall we say, a certain age might remember the rhyme, Lenti Penti Cruci Luci, for remembering these quarterly days of fasting. Lent, Pentecost, the Exaltation of the Cross, and the Feast of St. Lucy. The Ember Days, more properly the Quatuor Tempore, or the 4 times, consist of the Wednesdays, Fridays, and Saturdays following, as I said, St. Lucy's Day in December, the first Sunday in Lent, Pentecost, and Holy Cross Day in September. I learned something interesting in preparing this. The Japanese dish tempura has its origin in Portuguese cuisine because of the meatless fasts of the Quatuor Tempore, the 4 times. So these days were traditionally, though for reasons not entirely certain, set apart for the ordination of priests and deacons. Although this practice has in the modern Catholic Church fallen largely into abeyance. It's possible that there is a relationship to the medieval quarter days in Britain, which were the days on which servants were hired. We, as clergy, are, of course, always servants of the congregation. The ultimate origin of the Ember Days may be traced to the pagan agricultural feasts of the Roman tradition. And I think we're all familiar with the tendency of the Christian church to co-opt and appropriate earlier traditions for its own purposes. A more generous reading might suggest that this, rather than appropriation, this is an integration of Christianity into the broader paradigm of pre-Christian natural religion. The 4 Ember Days date back at least to the end of the 5th century, but are probably much older. There is a mention of the 4 seasonal feasts in the writings of Philastrius in the mid-4th century, and they likely date to at least the reign of Pope Calixtus I in the early 3rd century. So the idea of 4 feasts of the times is a very ancient. The Christian liturgical calendar can be thought of as the intertwining of 2 structurally different ways of marking out the rhythms of the year, what are termed the proper of time and the proper of the saints. This refers to the proprium, that is to say, that part of the Christian liturgy which varies according to time as opposed to those elements that are more consistent throughout the year. The proper of the saints consists of the feast days and commemorations of particular holy persons and their attendant distinct liturgical observances. That is to say, the specific prayers and collects which are unique to the saints' days. The proper of time, on the other hand, consists of liturgical seasons, which are structured around the major feast days of the Christian calendar. For the Catholic Church, these are defined in the universal norms on the liturgical year and the calendar, which emerged from the Second Vatican Council. It is, however, nonetheless consistent with long historical practice within the Western Church. The liturgical calendar consists of both fixed feasts, which have a particular date assigned to them according to the Gregorian or Julian calendar, such as Christmas, the birthdays of historical saints, and movable feasts, which are generally dated in relationship to the date of Easter, which is calculated according to the lunar solar calendar that has its roots in the Hebrew calendar. With some variation, the Catholic liturgical year forms the basis of the calendar for most Protestant churches. Thus, Western Christianity generally has a relatively consistent set of yearly liturgical observances, all the way down to the particular colors associated with each season. So, the Catholic liturgical year consists of 6 separate seasons. So, I'm going to sort of march through these, and if I were the kind of person who used slide decks, I suppose it would be helpful to have some illustrations of this, but certainly one can find lots of illustrations of this online. The 6 seasons consist of Advent, the 4 weeks before the fixed feast of Christmas. Christmas itself, usually understood as lasting from the Feast of the Nativity to Epiphany or Theophany. Lent, the 6-week period leading up to Easter. The Paschal Triduum, the 3 days of Good Friday, Holy Saturday, and Easter Sunday. The Easter season, which lasts for 50 days until Pentecost. And this ordinary time, which actually consists of 2 separate segments, the 4 to 8 weeks between Epiphany and the beginning of Lent, and the approximately 6 months after Easter. So there are 6 separate seasons. Each season is specifically designated by its liturgical color. And that's generally associated both with the altar dressings and the celebrant's vestments. But also, it's associated with particular variations in the liturgy, which are part of these celebrations. For example, the suppression of the Alleluia during Lent, or the suppression of celebration of the Mass on Good Friday and Holy Saturday. The colors are as follows. And these are, as I said, fairly consistent throughout Western Christianity, and not just the Catholic Church. Advent is purple. Christmas is white. Lent, again, is purple. The color of the Triduum is black because it leads to the crucifixion and the harrowing of hell. But Easter is white, culminating in the Pentecost red. And ordinary time is green. Now, there are some exceptions in terms of vestments. Rose vestments are worn for the third Sunday of Advent, Gaudete Sunday, and the fourth Sunday of Lent, Laetare Sunday. And I love the fact that Gaudete, Laetare, could both reasonably be translated from the Latin as rejoice. And so we get this beautiful rose or pink color. Blue vestments are worn only for the Feast of Mary. Each color, of course, has important and specific symbolic correspondences. Notably, red is used for the feasts of all of the apostles except John, whose feast is celebrated with white vestments, because John was the only one of the apostles not to be martyred. But I will leave it to listeners to draw other conclusions as they will about this exceptions. Largely, the liturgical calendar of the AJC follows this Western model, as we're going to see later on. And this isn't particularly surprising, given that much of the original AJC sacramentary was drawn from the traditions of the liberal Catholic Church, which generally follows Western norms in the majority of its practices, as we were mentioning during the sort of brief history lesson during the Q&A session. In the Orthodox churches, there's a much greater variation in the structure of the liturgical year. Many of the older Oriental Orthodox churches, the African Orthodox churches, have their own unique structures that define the rhythm of liturgical life over the course of the year. In the Byzantine or Greek tradition, however, the liturgical season is defined in terms of the 12 great feasts, and also the particular fasts associated with the somewhat more rigorous ascesis of the Eastern tradition in terms of lay, monastic, and clerical discipline. So a quick word about calendars in the Eastern tradition. As I'm sure most of you know, most of the Orthodox world retained the older Julian calendar after the reforms of Pope Gregory XIII on 24th of February, 1582. It's interesting to note that before the general adoption of the date of February 29th for the extra day of leap year, the general practice was actually to have 2 days dated the 24th of February, right? So you'd have the 24th of February followed by the second 24th of February, because that was the date of the institution of the calendar revision. The original revision moved the date forward 10 days. So, put very simply, the 4th of October, 1582, was followed immediately by the 15th of October of 1582. So, at that point, the Julian and the Gregorian calendars were 10 days apart. At this point, the Julian calendar and the Gregorian calendars are now 13 days apart, and beginning March 1st, 2100, the difference will be 14 days. So they will continue to drift apart, as I said. As I'll say, many Orthodox churches still retain the older Julian calendar, despite the arguable real improvements in accuracy of the Gregorian reforms. especially the rectification of leap years. And over time, as I said, the Julian and Gregorian calendars will continue to drift further and further apart, although that separation is very slow. There is also a difference in the calculation of the date of Easter, or Pascha, that arises from the distinction between the Julian and Gregorian calendars. The calculations, the computus of the Eastern and Western churches both follow the same basic formula, which is that the Paschal celebration takes place on the first Sunday after the Paschal full moon. And the Paschal full moon is determined in relationship to the fixed approximation of the vernal equinox on the 21st of March. Now, it's not actually the first full moon after the vernal equinox. It's the first full moon after the 21st of March. And because of that, the date can vary significantly. As a side note, many of you might know that in my home parish of St. Michael's, we often use the Julian dates for our Easter celebration. And it would be very easy and perhaps not entirely inaccurate to attribute this to my own ego or my affection for Orthodox traditions and practices. The truth, however, is actually a lot more mundane. Over the years, a lot of the parishioners at St. Michael's had to miss Easter Mass because they had family obligations. And so moving the date to the less frequently, at least in the United States, celebrated Orthodox date meant that I was more likely to have butts in seats in church that day. Such are the adjustments that we sometimes make for the sake of logistics. Dionysius Exiguus was a 6th century monk, generally acknowledged as both the inventor of Anno Domini dating and also having constructed the most widely accepted computus or calculation for the date of Easter. The tradition of dating years from the birth of Christ, as opposed to the rule of the Roman consuls, was in part motivated by the idea that Christ would return 500 years after his birth, or again, later 1,000 years after his birth, or 1,500 years after his birth, or 2,000 years after his birth. This seems to be a recurring theme. Thus, it was important to know the particular date of his birth. The exact reasoning behind Dionysius's placement of the starting date isn't entirely clear, but it has been retained in the more ecumenical and appropriate terminology of the Common Era. In the Orthodox world, the liturgical year begins on September 1st, and that's known as the Indiction. And that is an inheritance from Byzantine practice. However, most of the fasts, which constitute much of the liturgical year as opposed to seasons in the Western model, are determined in relationship to the movable feast of Pascha. And so I want to go through the major fasts real quickly. The most important is the Great Lent, which begins 40 days before Pascha and begins with Clean Monday, since there's no tradition of Ash Wednesday in the Orthodox tradition, although its prevalence has occasioned the extremely infrequent creep of the practice into Orthodox faith. Sundays are included in the count of 40 days from Clean Monday to the Paschal celebration. And during this time, meat, fish, eggs, dairy, wine, and oil are generally abstained from, with varying degrees of rigor on various days. And this discipline doesn't just apply to clergy and monastics, but to the lay community as well. So much like the suppression of the Alleluia during Lent in the Western Church, the Divine Liturgy is also not celebrated on weekdays, in keeping with the more ascetic tone of this season. In the Orthodox Church, neither the 3 days nor Holy Week constitute their own season, but are considered part of the Great Lent. The liturgical text, it's referred to as the Triodion, covers the period from the 10th week before the Paschal celebration all the way up until Holy Saturday, when the Pentecostarian covers the period from Pascha to Pentecost. So that's the Great Lenten fast. The Nativity fast begins 40 days before Christmas, before Nativity, and roughly corresponds to the Advent season in the Western tradition, though it extends somewhat longer. The Apostles' fast occurs from the second Monday after Pentecost, which is the day after All Saints' Sunday, up until the feast of St. Peter and Paul on the 29th of June. Now, because it combines a determination by both a movable and a fixed feast, its length traditionally varied from 8 to 42 days. However, because of the peculiarity of the Gregorian reforms, this fast can actually be as long as 29 days now, or very strangely, in some years, it does not occur at all. So the calendar becomes very, very mutable in an interesting way. The fourth of the fasts is the Dormition fast that culminates in the Dormition, the falling asleep of the Theotokos, which corresponds to Assumption in the Western tradition. And it lasts from the 1st of August until the 14th of August, Dormition being celebrated on the 15th of August. It is stricter than the Nativity or the Apostles' fast, but is considerably shorter than the Great Lenten fast. So those are the 4 significant fasts. There are both fixed and movable feast days in the Orthodox tradition, and saints' days are celebrated much like in the Western tradition. However, the Orthodox tradition identifies 12 great feasts of particular importance. These are in addition to the Feast of Feasts of Pascha. Most of these are fixed, but 3 are dated in relationship to the Paschal feast. 4 of the feasts mark Marian events, whereas the remainder specifically honor events pertaining to Jesus Christ. Since the liturgical year begins on September 1st, the first of the great feasts is the Nativity of the Theotokos, or Marimas in the West, celebrated on September 8th. And that celebrates the birth of Mary to her previously barren parents, Joachim and Anna. That is a sort of extra-canonical story, but it has become an important part of the Christian tradition. The second is the Exaltation of the Cross on September 14th. This marks actual fairly late historical event, the recovery of the true cross by the Byzantine military in 629. It had been previously captured by the Persians from Jerusalem in 614. The third is the presentation of the Theotokos on November 21st. So according to the Proto-Evangelium of James, Mary is taken to the temple where she remains until she's betrothed to Joseph, in keeping with an oath that's made by Joachim and Anna. Nativity, or Christmas, on December 25th. I don't know that this requires any particular elucidation. But the baptism of Christ, Theophany or Epiphany, occurs on January 6th, and that's the 5th of the great feasts. The terms Theophany and Epiphany are both used in the Orthodox tradition, and they mark the date of Christ's baptism by John the Baptist. And this is a particularly important feast for me personally, because it marks the moment when the pre-Christian and the Christian traditions meet. I've always thought of John the Baptist as providing this sort of linchpin between the period of Judaism and natural religion and the period of the Christian and post-Christian tradition. The sixth is the presentation of Jesus at the temple, Candlemas, on February 2nd, that marks Simeon's recognition of the infant Jesus as the Messiah, which is a miraculous event that I think is often forgotten in the wake of other celebrations. The fact that Simeon recognizes this infant as the Son of God is, I think, very, very striking. Annunciation falls on March 25th. The date is, of course, positioned exactly 9 months before Christmas, and marks the visitation of Mary by the angel Gabriel. The 8th is the entry into Jerusalem, which corresponds to Palm Sunday in the Western tradition. It's the Sunday before Easter. In the Russian church, interestingly, I don't know why this suddenly occurred to me because I hadn't included it in my notes. Willow branches are often used in the Russian Orthodox tradition because there aren't a whole lot of palm trees around in Russia. This is one of the most joyous celebrations in the Orthodox calendar, but it's also the beginning of the preparation for the sorrowful events of the crucifixion. The Ascension of Christ is commemorated 40 days after Easter, and also coincides with the announcement from an angel that Christ would return in glory. 10th is the Pentecost, 50 days after Easter, when in the upper room the Holy Spirit descended upon the apostles, and they're granted the gift of tongues. This is, of course, recounted in the Acts of the Apostles. The 11th is the Transfiguration. The Transfiguration on Mount Tabor is another one of these really extraordinary moments when the pre-Christian tradition and Christian mythology meet, because Christ is transformed into a radiant being, and Elijah and Moses come to speak with him. And this is witnessed by Peter, by James, by John. And it really is, I think, one of the most striking moments in the Synoptic Gospels, which often depict the more prosaic elements of Jesus's life, even when he's working miracles. This instead is a complete transformation. And as we've already mentioned, the last of the great feasts is the Dormition of the Theotokos on August 15th. Mary's death is a little bit problematic in the Catholic tradition. Often it's held that she is assumed bodily. However, in the Greek tradition, the feast is known as kimesis, the falling asleep in death, which, by the way, is also the etymological root of the word cemetery. So, as we can see, the structure of the Orthodox liturgical calendar is very different in important ways from that of the Western tradition. It's defined more by practice, particularly specific changes in the liturgy, particularly hymns that are sung, the discipline of fasting and contemplation. But the overlaps are significant as well. And I think that this emphasizes a certain commonality of the universal Christian tradition. And that brings us to the calendar of the Apostolic Johannite Church. I want to real quickly take a glance at the chat just to see if there are any particular questions. It doesn't look like it, but as I said, we will have time for questions at the end of the presentation. How are we doing on time? I think we're still okay. As might be expected, there are elements of both the Western and the Eastern traditions in the liturgical calendar of the AJC. As I had indicated previously, the structure is much closer to that of the Western tradition, with seasons designated by liturgical colors, which often correspond to clerical vestments and altar dressing. But the AJC also recognizes specifically 12 movable feasts in addition to the Great Feast of Feasts of Easter, although these generally do not correspond to the great feasts of the Orthodox calendar. Broadly speaking, as the previous version of the sacramentary states, the Church's year divides itself into two portions. I'm quoting here. The first portion, from Advent to Pentecost, is devoted to the commemoration of the various scenes of the mystery drama of the life of Christ, which in itself, as Origen pointed out, is typical of the life of every Christian. The second portion, embracing all of the Sundays after Trinity, is left for the practice of virtues inculcated in the former. We now are going to be designating that latter period as the season of Trinity. So up until this point, the seasons were perhaps not as strictly defined as they are, for example, in the Western Catholic tradition, but they are easily identifiable in the table of feasts and holy days and distinguished by color. With this presentation, I hope to introduce, at the behest and with the approval of His Eminence, a more defined structure and to rectify certain errors and omissions which in one way or another have crept into our liturgical documentation. This is, of course, going to be an ongoing process, subject to alteration in the future. However, the guiding principle is to bring the documentation more in line with the customary practice within the AJC, and then also to bring the practice more in line with the consensus of the Universal Church. Individual feasts have their own colors. In general, most feast days are celebrated in white, although red is prescribed for certain feasts, often of a martial or specifically Johannite or Templar nature. Blue is prescribed for Sophianic and Marian feasts, as well as the feast of Joseph of Arimathea, who is counted among the myrrh bearers, along with the three Marys, and also Nicodemus. So I think the blue for Joseph makes a certain amount of sense. The vestment colors are somewhat more flexible in the AJC, and our rubrics hold that white or red are appropriate for almost any celebration of the liturgy. But there are still these prescribed colors which can be made use of. We can discern, in general, the large strokes of the liturgical year, which are clearly seasonal, although there is no ordinary time as such in the AJC liturgical calendar. Although long periods have green, which is the color of ordinary time in the Western tradition, as the liturgical color. And these occur after Epiphany and after Pentecost, and thus they parallel the season of ordinary time. So at this point, I'm going to be introducing a sort of seasonal structure that I think is implicit in the AJC calendar up until this point, but I think it makes sense to make it a little more explicit. Like the Catholic tradition, it's broken into 6 seasons. The season of Advent, beginning on the Sunday after November 20th, which extends up to and includes the Nativity celebration and can be seen as extending all the way up until Epiphany. The liturgical color for Advent is purple. Blue is acceptable, but is purple. Although the Nativity of the Divine Light is celebrated in white. I mention this because this is one of the errors that crept in. The season of Epiphany covers both the Feast of Epiphany itself and the following weeks until the beginning of Lent. This corresponds roughly to a period of ordinary time. The distinction can be seen in the move from the white color of Epiphany to the green of the post-Epiphany pre-Lenten period. The color of Lent is, like Advent, purple. Again, we won't mention a particular document in which they are designated as blue. It begins, as the Catholic tradition does, with Ash Wednesday, and extends to Maundy Thursday, which is the commemoration of the institution of the Eucharist. The 3 days of Triduum can be seen either as the culmination of the Lenten season or the beginning of the Easter season. These are, of course, the most significant times of the liturgical year, and so they make up their own season. The Easter season lasts up until Pentecost and is colored white, befitting the celebratory nature of this period of time following the resurrection. Trinity season, again, corresponding to the second period of ordinary time, extends from the Feast of Pentecost 7 weeks after Easter, which is appropriately colored red. Trinity Sunday is the first Sunday after Pentecost, and the next 25 weeks are identified in relationship to Trinity Sunday. Green is prescribed for the season, though exceptions to this include the 7th, 15th, and 26th Sundays after Trinity, which are specifically devoted to recognition of the Holy Spirit, and thus call for red altar dressings and vestments. Now, as I said, there are 12 movable feasts in addition to the great feast of Easter. The computus for Easter in the AJC is consistent with the historical practice of the church, but it's phrased specifically in this way, in a manner that I think is both precise and concise. The first Sunday, I'm quoting from the second entry here, the first Sunday after the full moon, which happens upon or next after the 21st day of March. If the full moon happens upon a Sunday, Easter is the Sunday after. Gives us a very, very precise computus, but it also means that Easter coincides perfectly with the date used in the Western tradition. So we have a list of these 12 movable feasts. Now, we shouldn't take from this list that these are the most important feasts of the year, as there are particular commemorations that might well hold an equal place in the calendar. Advent Sunday, has already been mentioned, is Sunday on or after November 20th, and marks the beginning of the Advent season, which is generally celebrated in the AJC in a similar manner to that of the Western churches. Ash Wednesday is the first day of the Lenten season, Wednesday preceding the first Sunday in Lent. Naturally, this is determined by the computus for Easter. The first Sunday in Lent is precisely 6 weeks before Easter Sunday. Passion Sunday, which we hadn't mentioned up until this point, occurs on the 5th Sunday of Lent. It's no longer widely celebrated in the Catholic tradition, as it was before the removal of the season of Passiontide from the liturgical year in 1969. It's now more common for the Gospel account of the Passion to be read at Catholic Masses on Palm Sunday. Palm Sunday, now referred to explicitly as Palm Sunday of the Passion of the Lord in the Catholic tradition, corresponds to the entry into Jerusalem in the Orthodox tradition and occurs a week before Easter. Maundy Thursday is the Thursday preceding Easter. Good Friday, Holy Saturday are the Friday and Saturday of the Triduum. Ascension Day occurs 40 days after Easter. Pentecost, 7 weeks after Easter. Trinity Sunday, 8 weeks after Easter. And the Feast of Corpus Christi, which again we had not previously mentioned, is the Thursday after Trinity Sunday. This is a particularly Catholic feast that was established by Urban IV in 1264. It was actually first proposed by Thomas Aquinas, but it's really the culmination of the work of Juliana of Liège, who's a Belgian canoness. And it is a celebration of the Eucharist itself. And it's important for those churches for whom the real presence of the Eucharist is of particular importance. Of course, the The fixed feasts of the AJC are perhaps too numerous to catalog in a brief presentation, but they're available to our laity, seminarians, and clergy for their own study and personal reflection. They include feast days of traditional saints of the Universal Church, including the archangels, uniquely Johannite saints, and our predecessors on the initiatic path tread by us, their successors, and commemorations of important historical and biblical events which are significant for our particular church. For members of the AJC, the celebration of the liturgy and other rituals is never undertaken without profound contemplation of the intent and meaning of the symbolism included in them. We should never be afraid to ask the question of the meaning or significance of some date, some practice, or some idea. This questioning is precisely what prevents us from slipping into superstition and legalism, in which we lose sight of the inner meaning of these celebrations and become simply automatons rehearsing traditions from rote because it has always been done that way. Now, this means that the structure and practice of the church is also subject to evolution. And we can see this process underway even today as we reconsider certain well-established rules, regulations, and practices in light of inquiry into their deep symbolic meaning. These symbols ought always to serve the purpose of drawing us closer to the gnosis, closer to the divine. And this is not possible when those symbols are reduced to empty glyphs. And I think that this is nowhere more true than in the cycles, seasons, times, and tides of the liturgical calendar, which represent a rich variety of meaningful correspondences, correlations, and symbolic references. The ritual practice that is enshrined in the liturgical calendar offers us a mechane, to use the Greek word, a mechanism by which we can enrich the life of the church through a deeper connection with its spiritual source. Even when these symbols are drawn from older traditions, these traditions are interrogated and understood so that they remain, in the words attributed to Gustav Mahler, not the worship of ashes, but the preservation of fire. My hope, as I've indicated, is that this is merely an introductory examination of the historical structure of the liturgical year, with particular emphasis on the specific practice of the Apostolic Johannite Church and its relationship to its predecessor traditions. However, this should not be where our understanding of the liturgical year ends, but merely where it begins. In future talks, I hope to examine both the particular feasts of the AJC and some of the allegorical and narrative lenses through which one can look at the progress of the liturgical year in order to more deeply understand its profound richness and beneficial use for the Christian initiate, with sights set always on the pole star of Gnosis. Thank you very, very much. I entirely lose track of time, as always, but I think that came in just about right.
Yeah, we've still got plenty of time for questions. That was excellent, by the way.
Excellent. Thank you very much.
Mona had a question up front. Curious if more could be said as to why the Eastern Orthodox Church celebrates Transfiguration after Pentecost, even though it happened in Jesus' life before the crucifixion.
I have to look back this way. Did I make sure I didn't make a mistake here? Let me look very quickly at that and see if I can come up with an answer on the fly. Okay. Annunciation, Ascension, Pentecost. Yeah, that is interesting. Pentecost is 50 days after Easter, where the Feast of the Transfiguration is on August 6th. Now, of course, realize that as I said, because time is always a circle, right? We've got Pentecost celebrated after Easter, Transfiguration all the way getting into to August. But the origin of that particular date is not something that I am entirely clear on. And you can hear me clicking away because naturally I'm going to Google it. So I'm wondering if that there is some particular rationale behind it that I would have to research. So I honestly, it had not even occurred to me that one would think that in the historical course of events that this would happen sometime after the entry into Jerusalem, I guess. But there's, of course, a lot going on there, as we say. So I'm not entirely sure of the reason for that dating. It's something that I'll have to take a look at. And perhaps, somebody else, I know that this is going to eventually be widely distributed. And so it may be that somebody's got some better information on that than I do. It's a really good question. Are there any other questions?
Yep. We have Jeb mentioning, as a Presbyterian kid and teen/adult atheist, up until about a year ago, said, I love the idea of feast days for saints, but I'm not sure how that translates into individual practice since we can't meet for all of them. Do folks pick a few faves and throw on a brisket in the smoker on their days? I sure hope so.
That's actually not too far from the truth right there.
Yeah.
I mean, this is secretly the Church of Smoked Meat. So
read a bit from each saint and reflect on their feast days. I'm mostly just excited about trying all this new stuff and looking for cool ideas.
That's such a wonderful question. Certainly, most of the parishes of the AJC do not meet frequently enough to recognize all of these feast days. In much the same way as though the Mass is certainly offered in the Catholic tradition for all the feast days, you're not attending as a layperson most of those in most cases. There are, of course, important exceptions to that. So I think that because we do have specific collects and specific readings that are set aside for the feast days of the saints, it does enable one to engage in a kind of contemplative practice, to consider the particular virtues and the symbolic references of the saints. So I think that often people do pick a few favorites, things that particularly resonate with them. For example, for myself, the Feast of St. Thomas and the Feast of St. Michael are of particular importance for me. The Feast of Hypatia of Alexandria is important to me. And of course, Julian of Norwich. So there are a couple that sort of stand out as particularly important for me personally, in addition to the ones that I think are particularly important for the church more generally. The two feasts of St. John, Bernard Raymond Febre Palapra, various Templar feasts, and so on and so forth, are specifically important for the Johannite tradition. And so I think that those perhaps are more regularly celebrated than perhaps some of the other ones. Scott has an answer for us. The August 6th date was the date of the dedication of the first church built on Mount Tabor, traditionally considered to be the high mountain of the Transfiguration. So So there we have a good answer already. Thank you
You
for
say
that.
he's also got his hand raised.
That was also that was in the 4th century.
Right. That sounds about right. Yeah.
And then I wanted to show Jeb, this is my little St. Joseph altar as an idea of an individual practice for if you're interested in commemorating a specific saint. You can make a little altar and put out a candle and say a prayer to the saint and say, you know, thank you for your contributions, and we appreciate what you did, and we hope to follow your example and inspire us to follow the example of the particular saint. So some of it depends on, you know, how deeply you want to go into it, and then some of it depends on your resources. But there are usually, if you go to a Catholic supply store, you can usually find either an icon or a
metal
saint card.
Yep.
And I have an example of a saint card on that altar. Just a second, I'll turn the video back on so that we can see it right there. So that's a card for Saint Joseph, and it'll have a prayer on the back. And the prayer is going to be very Catholic. And so it's going to talk a lot about sin and suffering and at the hour of our death and that kind of thing. But you can always modify it to keep sort of the spirit while not necessarily taking the theology into account.
I was going to mention that at least locally with St. Joe's, parish of St. Joseph of Arimathea. By the way, I love the idea of blue vestments for St. Joe, because
He's one of the myrrh bearers. Yeah.
Well, the Grail, right? The Grail also. So because you know, I like that shit. But I mean, what we tend to do locally is we tend to get thematic. I mean, sometimes our meeting dates kind of fall between feasts, and so as is kind of custom in the AJC, you kind of pick. Now, there's some days that, you know, if you're stuck between St. John's Day and somebody else, well, you pick St. John. But most of the time, you know, you've got a little bit of choice in that thing. So to give an example from our current upcoming calendar for our online meetings, and by the way, regardless of where you're located, we meet 4 times a month. 2 of those are online. Anybody is welcome to join in. So one of the days that we have on our calendar coming up for June is the Feast of Josephine Peladan, the artist, Martinist, occultist, and possessor of impressive hair. Matter of fact, you know, he had a beard much like Prentice, and he just had fantastic clothes. So one of the things that Peladan is noted for, you know, in terms of the French occult revival, his idea as, you know, artistry and whatnot as a path to transformation, enlightenment, or gnosis. So the idea, whether that's art or music, I mean, he was one of the folks who pioneered the Rose Croix salons and that salon movement of meeting and discussing high ideas and art, theater, music, and whatnot. So, for example, for Peladan's day, you know, type of thing, you know, we tend to talk about art and spirituality and those kind of things, and or, you know, engage in some ourselves, right? The idea of art as a transformative practice. So if you look at much as folks have mentioned explicitly, you know, if you look at kind of the background and the intent behind the feast day, you can take it and you can kind of construct things, and some stuff will have, you know, some stuff will jump out at you automatically. I mentioned in an earlier session where I was talking about pilgrim saints, and Christianity is a pilgrim tradition, that anytime you engage a pilgrim saint, you're always leaving somewhere and going to somewhere else. So what is it that you take with you to bring to where you plan to arrive? And what is it that you adopt from where you arrive? And what's the third thing that is created when those 2 things meet? Right. So a pilgrim saint is an opportunity to kind of engage that twilight or liminal or in between type of thing. And there's plenty of saints that have that quality. On Sunday, we're going to hear about Bridget of Ireland, who, you know, has that type of thing going on all over the place. So I think there's lots of opportunity. Some of it will come with 2,000 years of history and practice, and other parts will require some adaptation or creativity. But there's buttloads of opportunity when it comes to feast days.
Yeah. Lynn asked whether there would be additions to the Office of the Hours for feast days, and Bishop Rosbeck, who also serves as the prefect for the Congregation for Liturgical Rites, rightly said that there is nothing that is specifically included at this point, though those rituals are sufficiently flexible that certainly those particular devotions could be incorporated in very, very easily. So yeah. Any other questions? And yes, his Eminence did in fact use the term buttloads.
The other thing I was going to throw in addition to kind of thematic stuff, and it depends on where you live. Some stuff is going to have pre-built stuff in terms of shrines or dedicated churches, from or centers from other traditions. But of course, the idea I talked about pilgrim saints, but also the idea of pilgrimage. And I'm going to I don't know if Jason is in this call, but I can feel him rolling his eyes from here when I say this. There's a certain quality we can engage when we engage with specific saints and specific feasts that allow us to kind of put ourselves in a particular headspace. The worn out example I use, of course, is the crappy 80s Sylvester Stallone movie Over the Top, right? Where, when he wants to get into the zone so he can beat his opponent, he turns his hat around because it's like a switch. And invoking good old evil Uncle Al, Aleister Crowley, the black sheep of our esoteric family, who nevertheless always gets invited to family reunions, even though people talk shit about him year after year. I think, I can't remember if it was Magic in Theory and Practice, he talks about the idea of, making a simple change, a simple change in one's external life in order to reflect or trigger a change in one's internal life, right? And the example he uses, of course, is moving a ring from one finger to the other. And so I think a similar thing can be done in terms of saints, whether it's dedicating some time, traveling to a specific spot in nature, an article of clothing, a particular prayer, ritual, meditation, visualization, or symbol, something that says, we are in this particular space and time, which represents a particular thing, and I'm going to immerse myself in that quality, right, for the purposes of transformation. Because as good old evil Uncle Al also noted, pray long enough with your lips and eventually you will pray with your heart, right? And the same is true, the same is true with the company we keep, right? The old saying of, tell me who your friends are and I'll tell you who you are, right? That is true also of the saints and the feast days, and I think particularly, and I think Mar Thomas highlighted also particularly by the feasts that he chooses to put emphasis on, right, in terms of that kind of immersion. Any last questions,
Parting
comments?
shots?
Buttloads of Canadians? The metric system?